In October of 2005, after Justice Bosire had completed his investigation on the Goldenberg Affair, in his report to President Mwai Kibaki, he wrote something very deep that I couldn't help but notice the weight in this statement. He wrote, and I quote, "The Goldenberg Affair was a cancer that burrowed deep into the soul of our nation. It stole not just billions, but our trust, our sense of fairness, and the very idea that justice prevails. The scars it left ran deep, a constant reminder of the greed that can fester in the shadows. But even the deepest wounds can heal. This report is a scalpel laying bare the truth, and with it comes the hope accountability will be the cleanser. Then and only then can we begin to rebuild brick by brick a Kenya where such a betrayal can never again take root." End of quote. The Goldenberg Affair was the single most greatest corruption scandal Kenya has ever experienced till date, that happened in the early 1990s. It robbed the country of a total of 138 billion Kenya shillings that has never since been recovered. Till date, the country still pays for the sins committed by the greedy perpetrators of this scandal. At the time Goldenberg Affair happened, a huge majority of us were young and could not comprehend what was happening. So I have spent hours scouring through over 100-page investigation reports to understand how a scandal of such magnitude could have been carried out, and I have compiled this documentary of the series of events and characters that made up this scandal. So sit tight as I take you through the Goldenberg Affair.
Correct. You are saying the country lost money through Goldenberg. You are saying also that it was not you. So who is it that lost the country this money?
To understand the Goldenberg Affair, you have to understand what the political and economic environment was like in those times. After the 1982 attempted coup, which is a whole story that we won't dive into today, a number of things happened. First, there was a constitutional amendment that made Kenya a one-party state with KANU as the only political party. Second, a secret ballot was dropped and the Q voting adopted. Also, several political assassinations happened. For example, that of Dr. Robert Auko. All of these happenings were against the international community's conditions for donations. To add salt to the injury, foreign exchange reserves were dwindling due to lack of clear economic policies in the country. These events ultimately led to a decline in the value of the shilling and inflation skyrocketed. This caused the country to rely on debt to finance its budgets. And where do you look up to when you need financial aid? You look up to the IMF and the World Bank. However, the World Bank and the IMF just don't dish out money. They will dictate on economic programs to you, the recipient, and so they did it to Kenya. Therefore, they came up with the Export Development Program, which was carried out by the then Finance Minister and Vice President, George Saitoti. Key to our story today, I'll expound on two of the many principles that were established then. 1. Export Compensation Scheme, and 2. Pre-Export Finance Scheme. The first, Export Compensation Scheme, was where an exporter in Kenya selling resources from Kenya would receive 20% of the currency you brought in. So, if you sold bananas to, say, Japan, when they pay you 1,000 yen for the bananas, when exchanging the yen to Kenyan shillings, the government will pay you Kenya shillings worth 1,200 yen, not 1,000 yen. In the second principle, the pre-export finance scheme, exporters could be loaned with finances to prepare the exports and pay back once they get returns. All this was done to promote exports and grow the economy from the pits we were in. Behind the curtains, however, one Kamlesh Damji Patni saw an opportunity to get insanely rich off this export program. Let's first talk a bit about this man Patni. Kamlesh Patni was born in Mombasa, Kenya, but held a British passport. He was the son of a gold jewelry dealer at Mombasa. Patni then moved to Nairobi from Mombasa sometime in 1987 at the age of 25. And with his elder brother, they established similar jewelry businesses along Dubois Road. Patney was a charismatic man, and it is with this charm that he drew close to where power resides. He first met Mr. Kanyotu, a director of intelligence within the Kenya Police Force and principal advisor to the president on matters security. It is Mr. Kanyotu that introduced Patney to the then President Daniel Moi. Now, back to our story. Patney hears about the new export program and goes to Mr. Kanyotu and the president and shares his greedy ambitions with them. Patney then set out to form the now infamous company, Goldenberg International Limited. In July of 1990, Goldenberg was formed and had only two 50-50 shareholders, Kamlesh Patney and James Kanyotu. Kanyotu, however, was a nominee shareholder of Goldenberg for the President Daniel Moi. The roles of Goldenberg as stated in the company documents were, and I quote, to carry on the business of import and export of any or all types of minerals, gold, silver, diamonds, precious and semi-precious stones in Kenya to Europe, India, and other parts of the world. And two, to prospect, explore, open and work claims or mines and dig and quarry for gold, silver, diamonds, precious and semi-precious stones in Kenya and other parts of East Africa. After setting up the company, Kamlesh Patney then went and applied for special treatment from George Saitoti, who was the then Vice President and Minister of Finance. He said in the application that Kenya has a lot of mineral wealth which is not being exploited properly. Among its mineral wealth, Kenya has a reasonable supply of diamonds and gold, but no amount is seen to be officially exported to earn Kenya the badly needed foreign exchange. End of quote. He then went ahead to ask to be granted three things. 1. A 10-year monopoly, meaning no one else in the country will be allowed to export gold and diamonds. 2. Instead of the 20% export compensation, Goldenberg would receive 35% to compete effectively with the smugglers. And 3. To be allowed to own a financial company for efficiency and for cheap transaction costs. Now, such huge steps of monopolizations and special treatment of a private organization would require approval by the cabinet and due legal processes. But the minister abused power and the application was approved. You know what? I'll add a crime counter here that will help us keep track of the crimes committed in this Goldenberg affair. So, our first crime. George Saitoti abused power, and he most definitely did this with an agreement of some benefits to him. So, bribery. Goldenberg also needed a dealer's license from the Department of Mines and Geology for it to be allowed to export gold and diamond. And since there were no diamond and there were trace deposits of gold in Kenya, it is definite that he fraudulently got the license from the commissioner, Mr. Collins Owayo. So again, bribery and abuse of office. Now they were ready to start their grand schemes. The Grand Goldenberg Affair was carried out in 5 different ways that we know of. The first was through export compensation. Here is how they did it. Now, in an ideal mineral export deal, as a mineral exporter in the country, you would be required to follow this procedure for you to export your minerals and get the 20% and 35% compensation that was part of the export program. 1. You would first, obviously, mine, process and package your minerals. Then, you would transport to the airport for it to be cleared by customs, and here you would complete a certain form for each mineral consignment. Then, the commodities you are exporting will be assessed by the Commissioner of Mines and Geology against the value that you declared in the form. Once satisfied, Customs forwards a copy of the form to CBK and you export your goods. Now, once your importer pays, another copy of the form is sent from your bank to the CBK to show that the proceeds of your exports have been received. CBK cross-checks these two forms from customs and from your bank and gives you the Kenya shillings for the foreign exchange that you brought. But remember the export compensation. The exporter will then bill the treasury, and the treasury will confirm with CBK to ask if your forms matched, and if given the go-ahead, will pay you the export compensation that was 35% of your export's worth. Goldenberg International Limited, however, from the onset knew that they had to buy off a number of people at all these junctures for them to get through this process, considering they were not mining anything, had no buyer overseas, and therefore no money would be sent to them. This is how they carried out their scheme. Goldenberg would first smuggle gold into the country. We know this because on 2 occasions, gold which Goldenberg was smuggling into the country was impounded at Wilson Airport after official hours. After smuggling, the box with the gold or diamond will be sent to the airport accompanied by the exporter or one of his people. Customs would then check it and fill the form. However, these exports will not even leave Kenya. And this could not happen without customs knowing, as it happened almost every time. So again, bribery and abuse of office by customs. Goldenberg said they exclusively exported to Switzerland and United Arab Emirates. The said buyers of gold, however, denied they had had any business dealings with Patni. The documents by Kamlesh Patni purporting the dealings were found to have been forgeries. This was from an admission by Patni himself, so forgery. Goldenberg had its first false trade in December of 1990, and on the forged documents, this export earned about $800,000. The funds were said to have been transferred electronically, but they however did not specify who sent the money. How they would really do this was they would send money to their offshore accounts and wire it back to the bank accounts claiming that they are proceeds of the export. But seeing how cumbersome this process of sending and resending, most of the rest of the payments were made in form of cash, where Goldenberg would locally convert Kenya shillings to other currencies here in Kenya and deliver foreign cash to the banks as proceeds of the export. At this time, Goldenberg was banking with the First American Bank, but after this bank got sense of what was going on, they asked Goldenberg to bank elsewhere, and they moved to Citibank and Kenya Commercial Bank, and they continued carrying out their dealings. This again was fraud, which is a crime. They needed to lie that these were proceeds of the export, so that the forms from the bank and customs were filled, and they were then sent to CBK to a specific person who, quote-unquote, cross-examined them. The CBK governor, Mr. Kotut, was well aware of this and was the man who made sure things ran smoothly and discreetly at the CBK. These are other crimes of bribery and abuse of office by the CBK officials. Goldenberg would then present to Treasury its claim for compensatory payment under the Export Compensation Scheme, and they will be fraudulently be paid the statutory 35% compensation. This first part of the Goldenberg Affair lost the country 7.3 billion Kenya shillings. While we are at it, let's start another counter of the money lost in this scheme so that we can keep track. Okay, so the 7.3 billion shilling was lost in this first part. The second way was through pre-export financing. Now, other than Goldenberg International Limited, Patni would a bit later set up another institution, this time a bank, namely Exchange Bank Limited. The major shareholders were Kamlesh Patni, James Kanyotu, again for President Moi, and a Mrs. Daksha Rana, all with 25% stake. Exchange Bank Limited, EBL, applied for a license to become a bank from the Treasury, claiming it had 40 million in capital. It was approved a week later, and on 1st October 1991, EBL was formed. But the actual capital invested in the bank at its inception was only 2,000 Kenya shillings, out of the 40 million that they had been initially agreed upon with the regulatory authorities. This takes us to other two financial crimes. breach of banking regulations, and misrepresentation of banks' capital. It was, however, not until June 1992 when EBL made its first trades. This was much later when the Goldenberg Affair had already been running for a while. Now, remember the pre-export financing that we talked about earlier? Goldenberg International and their bank, Exchange Bank Limited, were about to milk this scheme as well. In an ideal situation, this pre-export financing scheme was supposed to run like this. To get this loan money as an exporter, first you needed to have a solid contract or order from a foreign buyer who wanted to buy your exports. Then, you had to create a special kind of document called a bill of exchange, which is like a promise to pay. This document needed to be endorsed by a Kenyan bank where they would check the genuineness of the export trader. Once you had this bill ready, you could take it to the Central Bank of Kenya. They would look at it, and if everything was okay, they would give you money for it. The good thing about this money was that it came with a low interest rate at about 16.4, which was quite low compared to other types of loans. Repayment was to be made on completion of delivery of the export goods. Goldenberg was the biggest beneficiary of this loan facility. But they knew if they were to get exaggerated amounts as loans, they would not use Goldenberg International Limited alone to apply the loans, as this would raise some alarms. They therefore set up dozens of export companies that would apply for these loans through their bank, Exchange Bank Limited and Post Bank Credit, another bank that Patni had a hand in. They would set up fish exporting companies, marine cargo services, cultural ornaments, and so many more that would forge the bill of exchange documents. And since the genuineness of the importers was checked by the banks, in this case Exchange Bank Limited, they obviously approved their export orders without checking the genuineness of the importers. It was a walk in the park. They then took this bill of exchange document to the CBK, where Mr. Kotut, another accomplice, would approve and the loans would be given to these companies. But in real sense, all the money went to Goldenberg. This was another case of bank fraud, perjury, and forgery. By the time this pre-export finance was stopped, Goldenberg had outstanding loans of 4 billion Kenya shillings, which they never paid. The third way that Goldenberg Affair was done was through convertible foreign exchange or foreign certificates. This was another channel of fraud in the Goldenberg Affair. This is how they did it. Before introduction of these forex certificates, when you have some foreign currency like dollars or euros that you want to bring into Kenya, you had to tell the government where you got the foreign currency from and they can convert your currency to Kenya shillings. These forex certificates, however, were like special pieces of paper that you could buy with your foreign currency from the CBK or authorized dealers. And here's the catch. Once you had these certificates, you could exchange them back into Kenya currency whenever you wanted at the current exchange rate. You see, the longer you kept them, the more they were worth when you exchanged them back into Kenya currency. Kamlesh Patni's Exchange Bank Limited, EBL, was one of the authorized dealers that was allowed to sell these forex certificates and receive foreign currencies. Remember when we said that they converted Kenya shillings to foreign currencies to deposit to their banks as export proceeds? This is how they got the foreign currencies. But they also kept some foreign certificates for themselves. So when EBL sold these foreign certificates to CBK, they exaggerated the price, and from this, they got a total of 900 million Kenya shillings. On their part, CBK accepting to buy them at these exaggerated prices was a clear abuse of office, and since they obviously benefited, bribery. Another even bigger way that Goldenberg and EBL used these forex certificates was through exchange rate gains. Let me explain. Using these forex certificates, EBL got its hand on a bunch of foreign currency from the central bank, which was abnormal as CBK would not normally do this, but they did it. EBL then moved this money to offshore accounts outside the country. They then brought it back into the country, and since the central bank encouraged foreign currency to the country, for purposes of increasing its foreign reserves, EBL would sell this foreign currency back to CBK for Kenyan shillings at a much higher exchange rate. This process made Goldenberg and EBL a profit of 5.8 billion shillings. They also through another bank called Pan-African Bank, did the same, and through it they made another 370 million shillings. This was again another case of bank fraud. The fourth way Goldenberg carried out their scheme was through a process called check kitting. Goldenberg and Pan-African Bank, whose director was in on the game, defrauded several other banks through check kitting. Check kitting is where a person writes a check from their first bank account to deposit into their second bank account, even though there isn't enough money in the first bank account. The second bank believes that the check is good and gives the person access to the money right away, which they take for themselves. Before the first bank realizes there is not enough money to cover the check, the person quickly writes another check from the second bank, which also does not have any money, to the first bank. This makes it look like both accounts have money, but really it's just a bunch of checks from one bank to another with no money to back it. Mr. Kamlesh Patni and Goldenberg did this fraud between the banks Pan-African Bank, Post Credit Bank and Transnational Bank, and they were able to get away with 95 million shillings. And the fifth Goldenberg scheme to defraud the CBK was through dollar sale contracts. Exchange Bank Limited and Pan-African Bank entered a dollar sale contract with CBK. This is where Pan-African Bank and Exchange Bank Limited will be given Kenya shillings by CBK for them to give in return foreign currency to the CBK. Goldenberg would enter these dollar sale agreements and be given Kenya shillings by the CBK, but will never pay the equivalent foreign currency to the CBK. This dollar sale contract went on, and of course with the rogue CBK officials who were in on it, it kept going instead of them calling out the fraud to the authorities. Kamlesh Patni and his accomplices were able to draw 14.8 billion shillings from this scheme. This was another case of abuse of office and bribery. Other than all of this money whose movement was traceable internationally and locally, there was money which was transferred abroad, most probably to offshore accounts, but was never returned. This money totaled to 10 billion Kenya shillings. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what the Goldenberg Affair was. More than 38 billion shillings that we know of was lost, which if we factor in inflation will be around 138 billion shillings today. But that's not even the saddest part of it all. What happened after is even more heart-wrenching. Of all the fraud, outright theft, abuse of office, and even killings of traitors that made up the Goldenberg Affair, a total of 0 convictions were made. Yes, 10% of the country's GDP lost to few greedy individuals, but not a single one of them faced consequences. There were a few criminal charges, but as I'll explain, none of them led to anything. Now, the Goldenberg Affair took place between 1990 and went on until it was just too big to be contained by the perpetrators. It is in June 1992 that MP Jilo Fulana first brought up the matter to the general public, and the Public Accounts Committee summoned Mr. Kamlesh Patni for interviews. The chair of the committee, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, however dismissed the matter. It would later be discovered through Jaramogi Oginga Odinga's own admission that he had received millions of shillings from Mr. Kamlesh Patni for him to acquit Patni in the summoning. Mr. Patni also paid off other opposition leaders such as Kijana Wamalwa also to keep their mouths shut. A whistleblower from the CBK also shared incriminating documents from the CBK to 2 MPs, Mr. Paul Mwite and Anyang' Nyong'o, that showed the fraudulent payments made to Goldenberg International. But these 2 MPs were also compromised by being paid off millions by Patni, and the whistleblower was fired from CBK and criminally charged with sharing classified information. Another attempt was by Law Society of Kenya and Raila Odinga, who filed cases against Goldenberg International and the government officials involved. But these also did not bear fruit, and by the influence of the Attorney General Amos Wako, they were driven off by the courts. Meanwhile, local and international media caught wind of the corruption and reported on it often. Pressure grew from within, with Kenyan citizens and international donors. And that is when the CBK governor, Mr. Kotut, had no choice but to call in PwC, a top international accounting firm, to audit the books of the banks and institutions suspected. But before PwC could finish their investigation, Mr. Kotut, who was part of the Goldenberg Affair, resigned. But nevertheless, the investigation results came out, and to no one's surprise, there was indeed incidents of fraud. What was surprising, however, was the scale of the fraud and the people involved. Criminal and civil cases were filed against Mr. Patni, Saitoti, who was now former vice president, CBK governor, and others. Unfortunately, again, these cases against these powerful people were reduced to civil cases that asked Goldenberg to pay back money they owed CBK and Treasury. But of course, this never happened. At this point, the cases had grew stale to the public eyes and they were almost forgotten, until Mwai Kibaki became president in 2002.
Mimi Mwai Kibaki.
It is in 2005 that President Kibaki established a judicial commission of inquiry that carried out thorough investigation and recommended criminal charges against certain individuals. They published their findings in this report, which I have based most of my research from. After this investigation, Kamlesh Patni, James Kanyotu, CBK Governor Kotut, and his deputy were charged again, but over the course of time, they were all eventually acquitted on basis of lack of witnesses, lost documents, etc. They are all today free, if not dead. Patni, for one, went ahead to carry out another one of his gold scams in Zimbabwe. There is a whole documentary by Al Jazeera about it, which you can find on YouTube. The long and short of it is that it is the normal Kenyans that paid the price and not the criminals. It is the Kenyans' taxes that to date continue to fill the debt hole that Goldenberg Affair left. It is the Kenyans that suffered and continue to suffer from the inflation it caused. And it is us Kenyans who pay higher for imports due to our weak shilling that was a result of the Goldenberg Affair. I will now give my take on this whole Goldenberg Affair. What was special about the Goldenberg Affair was the way all our leaders were involved in it, from the president through his puppets, the opposition leaders, the leaders of institutions such as CBK, and the judiciary through the Attorney General. When a whole system that is supposed to keep each other in check is compromised, scandals of such magnitude can easily happen. And it is my view that since nobody guilty was convicted, or fined or paid consequence of any kind, the best reprieve we as Kenyans can get from this is to learn from the Goldenberg Affair, and to not let history repeat itself. Thank you for watching this mini documentary on the Goldenberg Affair. In the comment section below, tell me your thoughts on this and your opinion on what I have talked about in the video. As always, it was a pleasure writing and producing this documentary. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a donation through our M-Pesa till and join the community of video sponsors. Support us also through subscribing, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.